Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Jefferson Society, Erie's think tank for community progress, for advancing the future of the community and of the nation. All of us are aware this evening, that's why you're here, that in November's general election, Senator Toomey, the incumbent, will be up for re-election. He will face two Democratic challengers, or three in actually, but two of which are with us this evening, who will be seeking an opportunity to oppose Senator Toomey in the fall election. Mayor Fetterman of Braddock, and former U.S. Navy three-star Admiral Joe Sestak. I understand the time constraints of these impressive candidates and their schedules, and we want to thank them for taking the time to come to Erie to enlighten us, especially on the issue of foreign policy. Why did we choose foreign policy for tonight's discussion? It's because while we are often preoccupied with domestic policy, it is foreign policy that controls more than anything else the nation's destiny. I also want to thank the Pennsylvania Cable Network for broadcasting this event on their cable channel and on their website. It is a great public service. Our program director this evening will be Ben Spagan, who will moderate the debate and who will guide the questions in the evening's progress. Thank you very much for coming on a wet, rainy, cold evening to become warmer in your knowledge of who will lead in this critical election. Please welcome Mr. Spagan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garvey. I want to also thank Mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, and former three-star Admiral of the U.S. Navy, Joe Sestak, for agreeing to join us for tonight's Foreign Policy Forum featuring the U.S. Senate Democratic candidates. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Program Director at the Jefferson Educational Society, and I will serve as tonight's moderator. The format, which I'll go over now, is as follows. Each candidate will have up to 15 minutes for their opening remarks. The order of the candidates has been determined by a random drawing, and Mr. Sestak will go first. Once Mr. Sestak concludes his remarks, Mr. Fetterman will have 15 minutes for his opening remarks. Once each candidate has concluded his opening remarks, I will begin the question and answer session. Mr. Sestak will receive the first question since he is drawn first to respond. He will have 2 minutes to address the question. Remaining time may be yielded to the moderator in hopes of asking more questions, or it may be used to address other statements made earlier in the event. Following Mr. Sestak's response, Mr. Fetterman will have 2 minutes to address the question. He too may elect to yield any remaining time to the moderator, or he may use the remaining time to address statements made earlier in the event. The second question will be directed to Mr. Fetterman, and Mr. Sestak will have the opportunity to respond. Candidates will have 2 minutes to address each question, and I will continue to ask questions in this format, but if I do feel that a question has not been satisfied, I do reserve the right to ask either or both candidates for a follow-up. As we do here at all Jefferson Educational Society events, we are asking that the audience members participate. Audience members may write questions on pieces of paper provided by the Jefferson Educational Society staff. Audience members may address questions to a specific candidate. However, we do ask that they keep their nature of the questions to foreign policy. Once we have satisfied all questions and each candidate has had a fair and equal opportunity to respond to each question, we'll move on to closing remarks. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for his closing remarks. Again, having drawn first, Mr. Sestak will conclude first, followed by Mr. Fetterman. In the interest of adhering to our time policy, a timekeeper is in the front row. A candidate, when has 30 seconds left, will be shown a yellow card. When a candidate's time has expired, he will be shown a red card. I will move on to the next question upon seeing a red card. In the interest of saving time, we also ask that you hold your applause until the program's conclusion. Friendly reminder to those watching at home, thanks to Pennsylvania Cable Network, a special call-in program will immediately follow the conclusion of tonight's event at 8:30 p.m. Those interested in participating should call 877-PA6-5001. In the spirit of the Jefferson mission as a think tank for community progress, be that in Erie or the worldwide, I ask both the candidates and the audience to be respectful of this forum, this institution, and most importantly, to the democratic process. Mr. Fetterman, Mr. Sestak, again, thank you for taking the time to participate in tonight's event and look forward to hearing your thoughts, concerns, and visions. Mr. Sestak, you may now offer your opening remarks.
Thank you, Ben. And Dr. Garvey, thank you for hosting it here. And John, good to see you again. I was in the Navy 31 years. I never thought I'd end up on a stage here talking about national security. But I got out because after I came back from the war, the recent wars, my daughter, 4 years old, was struck with malignant brain cancer. I needed to get out, take care of her. My payback toward this country for the wonderful health care I got was to run for Congress for health care for everybody. But those 31 years in the United States Navy were bookended by two wars that are renowned. Vietnam, when I joined up out of high school, and Iraq, along with Afghanistan. I stayed all those years, though, for a special reason. I joined up, I wanted to serve my country, but I came to love the service because of the young men and women I served with. Come aboard an aircraft carrier. Their average age of those 5,000 sailors is 19 and a half. They run a nuclear reactor. They fix your plane before you get in, and nary a question is asked. A salute is given that young man or woman, and off the pilot goes into the night, knowing they were accountable to do their job. They came from Erie, they came from Braddock, they came from Potter County or Springfield, where I came from. They're our real national treasure. When I joined up during Vietnam, a larger percentage were eligible for food stamps than the population of America was taking as a percentage for food stamps. Pay was low, and they joined up. I lived with them. My first ship, 50 of us so in a room, pretty heel to toe. You get to know everyone and where they come from, and they really are the working family members of this great state and all of America. Housing problems. When you move, your house is underwater and the mortgage is underwater. It doesn't matter. The Navy says you got to go. Autism, twice as high in military families as it is in civilian life. And if you stay for a career, 60% of children are functionally disassociated of their children from high school by the time they go there. They go to Afghanistan or Iraq for 12 months, they come home for 12. They go back again, and often sometimes it's both parents. We used to have on the shopping bags in the commissaries of the Navy, Navy spouse, toughest job in the Navy. I loved them, the entire families. That's why when I got out, having taken care of their challenges as a division officer, department head, captain, taking care of them, we kept my office as a congressman open 7 days a week to 9 o'clock every night, just like we did on a ship. You could knock on my doors, Captain, any time during the night, even early morning hours, 2 or 3 a.m., because the ship's up all night. 1/3 of the crew is always awake at least. So their story is really my story. I graduated from high school, I went off. And at the Naval Academy, they sent me my last year to say, just take one course each semester, go to the National Security Council, study it. We're going to begin to invest in you because someday you may rise up to the highest echelons and work at that National Security Council. They sent me off to Harvard University in between tours to get a doctorate in political economy and government because the Navy leaders knew that the ebb and flow of the great powers was dependent upon a strong economy. And then, when I was ashore again, they sent me to work for General Powell on his staff in the Political Military Assessment Division to learn under that great leader. And then they sent me to the White House to work for President Clinton as Director of Defense Policy, to develop each year the National Security Strategy of Engagement. But I most loved those tours at sea. I extended my first tour an extra hour and delayed going to Harvard for another year. I loved being out there. I was honored, with the greatest honor anyone can be given in our nation, to be asked to lead the sons and daughters of our country into harm's way. on the ground in Afghanistan, head of the Navy's anti-terrorism unit, for a short mission, nothing like the Army and the Marines, who stayed there pounding away every day. Came out, took command of an aircraft carrier battle group. Strikes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And all that time, I walked away with one overarching lesson. Militaries can stop a problem. Militaries can never fix the problem. I doubt there's anyone listening who thinks we fixed Iraq, despite all our valiant effort and the decision, that tragic decision for us to go to that war. The most important decision a senator can make in his constitutional or her constitutional duty is the decision to go to war. I have learned 5 overarching principles by which we need to better address our national security approach in this world. The first is that diplomacy matters. Think about it. Through hardcore nose diplomacy, we kicked out of Iran recently their capability to have in 30 days 4 nuclear weapons. We kicked it out with economic sanctions that hurt, backed up by a strong military. With the option always there, now it will take them at least not 30 days, a year at a minimum, if they wanted to start again. In our Navy, we can't find the submarines in the Persian Gulf. They're 19 miniature mini submarines. We'd have to get out of there. The water's too shallow for our sonar to work. And those strikes, and we would if we have to stop them from having a nuclear weapon, would be very, very challenging. But we could only stop it for 4 years. Second principle, in a global world, no nation stands alone. When I commanded that aircraft carrier battle group off of Afghanistan and for the strikes, I had 30 ships under my command. Only 10 were United States ships. The Japanese were there. First time out of the Sea of Japan since World War II. Nations from all over the world had come together in a coalition together. When I was told to take that carrier battle group through the Straits of Hormuz to the Persian Gulf, for what we thought might be the running start to the war, we began some precursor strikes. Only the Australians and the British went with me. And right then I thought, it's going to be tough. And I flew in, I saw the 3rd Fleet commander, and he said, "What do you think, Joe?" I said, "We're ready to go." He said, "No, what do you personally think?" I said, "This is a tragedy. First, we're dividing our forces. And second, show me the clear and present danger to our nation, but we're ready to go." A coalition of the willing. And that is why the sculpture closest to the commander-in-chief of this nation, the Oval Office, is not of an American, but of a Frenchman, General Rochambeau, who won our freedom at the Battle of Yorktown in honor of that of another nation's general. His sculpture is closest to the seat of our commander-in-chief. Third, economic security is the bedrock of our national security. Look at the other part of the world, China, where it is actually dominating now, or trying to dominate the South China Sea, having built 4 artificial islands by which it's put on airstrips and stationed military equipment, and 4 naval conflicts as ensued, not for an arms race like with the Soviet Union we had, but rather economic security, because underneath that sea are minerals that are so rich, from 19 trillion cubic feet of natural gas that it wants to own. Much like it owns 99% of all rare earth minerals, and everybody's cell phone here, every munition our military uses has a rare earth mineral in it, and they have a monopoly on it. That is what the tragedy of the global war of terror is. It's a tactical issue we must address, but the strategic center of gravity of our nation truly is in the Western Pacific, and why 60% of your Navy has been moved by the President over there. Fourth, we must change how we measure our military. No longer should it be measured by how many ships, how many planes, how many brigades. We don't measure a computer power by how many computers, but by the capability. As an admiral, I advocated it, often against much opposition. We can't find many of those submarines out there, as I mentioned, but we have netted sensors that can pick up the magnetism of the fields of this Earth. And when a piece of metal moves, a submarine, a little small device can pick it up. I advocated that if an aircraft carrier today can actually do 10 times the targets do 15 years ago, How many aircraft carriers capability do? Let's dominate the new domain of cyberspace, because that's where the global war of terror is, unfortunately, you've read, being fought. So stop building a very good military, but one that is more costly and less efficient, where we're just buying hulls at times like the Cold War, rather than moving into the new domain for our defense of cyberspace. Like we changed from battleships to the aircraft carrier just before World War II, fortunately, with good leadership. And finally, don't go to war unless you know how to secure the peace. Never take that first step into policy until you know and have considered the last step. I doubt very many policymakers ever considered, after toppling Saddam Hussein, what that last step would be to secure the peace. Did they know even the difference back here in Washington, D.C. between a Shia and a Sunni? And that's my concern today in Syria. How will it end? Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill came together on a Navy destroyer in the Northern Atlantic before we entered the war and came out with the Atlantic Charter and said these are the principles of how we want it to end. We may destroy that caliphate in Syria, in Iraq, but what happens to the vacuum? In a country like Syria, where the infrastructure has been destroyed, millions of people have lost their jobs, have lost their lives and or dislocated. Who fills the vacuum? Is it the Kurds? Is it the 32 Sunni militias? How will it end that we don't stay there forever? As I end, I love the United States Navy. I used to run by saying, if I can't be in the Navy, I'm now trying to do the next best thing. I lived with those youth of America. They came from all over. I joined up at a time where they used to say the Navy or the jail. I loved it, and they were mighty fine. I ask everyone here to never forget that as I speak over there today, undoubtedly is someone from Erie, and their family is here at home. And so every senator who might be even listening or thinking of national security today, let's hope they think about the wisdom of the decision to go to war, that never again do we get in such a tragedy as that Iraq. No one is for a stronger defense than I am. But no one wants to make sure from the training they gave me how to secure the peace, having visited over 80 countries in this world and seeing that the power of our nation is respected in for the military, but it's admired for the power of our ideals and our economy. Let's make sure that diplomacy leads the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sestak. Mr. Fetterman, you may now offer your opening remarks.
Outstanding. Hello, Erie. It's really a pleasure to be back. I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago that I had the pleasure. I was invited to come up here and address the audience in this very space to talk about the work that I've done in Braddock. And how many here are familiar with Braddock? Just, kind of as a curiosity. I'm sorry? Whitaker. There you go. Town in the valley. So, at any rate, limited knowledge about Braddock here. So, Braddock is where it's notable for 2 reasons, I would say, historically speaking. The first is it's where Lieutenant George Washington received his first combat experience. He was under the command of then General George Braddock, and he survived, but George Braddock and the 600 of his troops were massacred there, and that was the start of the French and Indian War. And that's how, can we get a little bit here? That's the start of the French and Indian War, and that's notable because that's where George Washington got his first combat experience. And then we shift back to what really made Braddock famous and what really makes Braddock notable. We've all heard of Andrew Carnegie, correct? And that's where Andrew Carnegie got his start. Andrew Carnegie built his first steel mill in my community. And that's where it all began for Andrew Carnegie. It's where unlimited wealth was created. It's where unlimited prosperity was created. It was, Andrew Carnegie would go on to be the richest man that ever lived. And it all started in my community. The mill he built is the mill that I live across the street to this day. And that mill in my community is the last functioning steel mill in the Pittsburgh area, which is a remarkable statement considering half the world's steel came from that region as a whole. How does somebody that looks like me with my kind of background end up on a stage here talking, running about the United States Senate? It's a really curious story, and I wanted to take my opening remarks to explain how I got here. I was born and raised in York, Pennsylvania. Anyone here York, Pennsylvania? Is York, Pennsylvania known as a hotbed of progressive Democratic politics? Not so much. My standard stump speech joke is that I hope I'm the first Democrat that my family votes for on April 26th. My parents are conservative, lifelong Republicans. My grandparents, conservative, lifelong Republicans. I can't find a Democrat in my entire family tree on this side. So it's incredibly unusual for me to be running as a progressive candidate in this Senate race. But my journey, how I got there, is I was born into a loving two-parent household. I never had to worry about a lot of the things that people in my community now have to worry about. Just today, I heard from a resident who had his water shut off, and we're going to help get that water turned back on. I never had to deal with that when I was a child, and I kind of took it for granted in retrospect. I knew what love was. I came from a stable two-parent household. My parents read to me at night. Education was valued. In fact, it was a priority. My parents said, you get yourself into college, we'll take it from there. And that's exactly what I did. And I didn't really appreciate it at the time the way I should have. So I went to undergraduate school, got a degree in finance, went to go get my MBA in finance. And I envisioned that I was on a very distinct career path, one that never would have included what I ended up doing. And all that changed on the night of April 6, 1993, when I was waiting for my best friend to come pick me up to go to the gym, and he was killed in a car accident through no fault of his own. And that really shocked me, and that left me reeling, trying to figure out, wow, what if I woke up tomorrow morning and I had 20 minutes left to live? And I began to really look inside myself and analyze the kind of life that I had lived, and have I made the most of what I had been given? The random lottery of my birth put me into a pretty comfortable situation. So what I decided to do from that tragedy is I joined Big Brothers and Big Sisters. And I was paired with a little 8-year-old boy. And his father died from AIDS 3 months earlier before we met. And when I walked into his house to meet him for the first time, his mother was in a bedroom, and she had full-blown AIDS, and she basically had 3 weeks still left to live. So I went in there, and she could barely raise her arm to shake my hand. And that's what really fried my circuits. I was like, how can this be? How in this country can we have an AIDS orphan living 6 blocks away from one of the world's most elite universities? How can I be born into a circumstance where I have a master's degree and I have security and I have a future, and this little boy is an AIDS orphan before his 9th birthday? And then I didn't realize that what I had to do is I quit my job, and I decided that I was going to dedicate my life to confronting inequality in all of its shapes. So I joined AmeriCorps, if anyone's heard of AmeriCorps. I joined AmeriCorps and I ended up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Never set foot in Pittsburgh before then. And if any of you here are from Pittsburgh or are familiar with Pittsburgh, I ended up in the Hill District, which is a large historic African-American community. And I taught GED classes to young parents. And these young mothers and these young fathers were coming in with a 4th, 5th, 6th grade reading levels. And it wasn't their fault. The random lottery of birth put them in a community, put them in a school, put them in a family, put them in circumstances that were beyond their control. And it's no wonder. They may not have had the support at home. They may not have been able to, their parents may not have had to work 2 or 3 jobs to keep a roof over their head. Who knows? But at the end of the day, it drove home to me again that this kind of inequality, this kind of disparity just can't persevere in this country. Something has to be done about it. So I taught GED classes for those 2 years, and I decided I need more education. So I left for Harvard University to the Kennedy School of Government, and I got a public policy degree. And from that, because of that, I wanted to create a toolkit, if you will, to combine social work, business, and public policy into something that I could use to confront inequality and disparity where I saw it in my own professional career. After finishing up my time at the Kennedy School, I was offered the chance to start a program in Braddock, Pennsylvania. This is July of 2001. And people, when I said I'm coming to Braddock, they said, "Are you nuts?" Like, seriously. Did Braddock have a good reputation to anyone who's familiar with it? No. What was most of the things said about Braddock? You're nuts, right? You're crazy. Do you have your vest? And I don't mean a down one, I mean bulletproof one. Genuinely concerned for my safety, actually, especially, but that's not what I found. I found an incredibly loving, welcoming community that was just simply looking for somebody to kind of just jump in and begin to care. And the GED program that I started was incredibly successful. Dozens and dozens of young people went through and got their GEDs. And it was exactly what I wanted. It was gratifying. I was making a difference, making an impact. And up until that point, until 2 of my students were gunned down a short time from each other. And I was again confronted with this decision. It's like, I want to change this. I want to change this circumstance, but I can't do it as a program director. I could have helped these young men get their GEDs, but I couldn't have done anything to save their life. So I made the choice to run for mayor of a community. Now, everywhere I go in Pennsylvania now, especially with the campaign, I often get recognized. On the flip side, though, I often have people cross the street thinking that I'm going to mug them. So I don't, everywhere I go where if I'm not known, I've never been mistaken for an elected official. So when I announced that I was going to run for mayor, I got a lot of strange looks from people. And they said, are you nuts? You haven't lived here for barely a year and a half. And by the way, you look a little different than, most of the folks living here. And, why even bothering? They would have been right, if except for one thing. And those young people that I worked with, those young people I was lucky enough to serve, ended up knocking on doors and going door to door with me and helping me. And they're the ones that got me elected. And I won that first election by one single vote. And you say, my vote doesn't count. Well, in my case, it did. And I'm standing here before you tonight because that one person took the opportunity to vote, and it was a provisional ballot on top of that. So in other words, that person showed up and they said, you can't vote. And that person knew their rights, and I'm standing here because of you for that very reason. And after that first election, I've spent the last 11 years in Braddock working on issues that are now really at the forefront of the Democratic debate that we're having as a policy. Inequality, adult basic education, universal pre-K, the nation's war on drugs, community policing, gun violence, gun control, marijuana legalization, immigration, LGBT rights, all of these things, all of these issues that we've exercised leadership on in Braddock, during my time. And it's great. I'm happy to see that presidential debates are occurring in Flint, Michigan, and places like Youngstown, Ohio. But me personally, you need to do more than show up with a case of water in Flint, Michigan, get your picture taken, handing it over, and then get on your private jet. I think you need to make an investment. I think it's important the way you live your life. And the investment that I made, I've committed myself professionally to confronting inequality. And I've been a champion for Braddock for the last 11 years, last 15 years if you count my GED experience. And that's why I'm running for the United States Senate. I want to be a champion for all of Pennsylvania's communities. All of Pennsylvania's communities whose days they feel like the best days are a generation ago. And that's why I'm in this race. That's why I'm here asking, for your support. I want to thank you for the opportunity to do that, and I look forward to getting into these issues with Admiral Sestak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fetterman. Admiral Sestak, the first question goes to you. Again, 2 minutes to respond, and then Mayor Fetterman, you'll have 2 minutes to respond as well. Question 1. In mission failure, America and the world in the post-Cold War era, which Thomas Friedman heralds as a must-read for the next president of the United States, Professor Michael Mandelbaum writes that the United States, after the Cold War, became the equivalent of a very wealthy person, the multi-billionaire amongst nations, leaving the realm of necessity that it had inhabited during the Cold War and entering the world of choice. It has chosen to spend, Mandelbaum continues, some of its vast resources of power on the geopolitical equivalent of luxury items, the remaking of other countries. Do you agree with the basis of Mandelbaum's assertion that the remaking of countries has become the United States foreign policy? What is or should be, in your opinion, America's chief mission abroad?
I read excerpts of his book and actually took a course from Michael Mandelbaum at Harvard University. I have great respect for him. And I think what he points out is one of the major errors that the book Rise and Fall of the Great Powers shows. The Dutch were one of the greatest military powers in the world, and economic powers. And then they went about the world misusing their military. And those are the rise and falls of the great powers. And in the cases he points out, like Iraq, that has cost us $3 trillion, with Afghanistan, about 1.5 or so for the beans and the bullets, but another 1.5 to 2 for the post-traumatic stress disorder, the loss of our human capital that never came home. I visit a prison every year to visit to go to my vets and see them as a congressman and even today. What Michael Mandelbaum is pointing out is exactly important in terms of a number of decisions that were made, but not all the ones that he points out. It's the reason I did not support Libya, for example. I did not know how it would end. I didn't know the exit strategy. I think a better piece for us to take from what has occurred is the following. If you are to make a decision to go around this world, first off, understand that you must weigh the cost and the benefits. Second, you must have an exit strategy based upon the benchmarks that you have to achieve to get there. We did none of those in several of the cases that he pointed out, but that is the tool we need to see whether you should or shouldn't intervene in a few of the cases that he did point out. Great point, but I wouldn't take it holistically.
Thank you, Admiral Sestak. Mayor Fetterman, I can restate the question if you like.
Yes, please.
In Mission Failure, America and the World in the Post-Cold War Era, which Thomas Friedman heralds as a must-read for the next President of the United States, Professor Michael Mandelbaum writes that the United States after the Cold War became the equivalent of a very wealthy person, the multi-billionaire among nations, leaving the realm of necessity that it inhabited during the Cold War and entering the world of choice. It has chosen to spend, Michael Mandelbaum continues, some of its vast resources of power on the geopolitical equivalent of luxury items, the remaking of other countries. Do you agree with the basis of Mandelbaum's assertion that remaking countries has become the United States foreign policy? What is or should be, in your opinion, America's chief mission abroad?
Well, the way I look at it is that I wouldn't ascribe it to something as specific as we set out to do these things. I would say that I would attribute it to this idea that what is a war of choice at the end of the day, and versus what is an existential threat to the United States. And we have made an incredibly bad decision as a nation during my entire lifetime. I'm 46 years old. When I was at the Kennedy School, I had the unique opportunity to learn from Robert McNamara. And Robert McNamara, as you most probably know, was the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War in the Kennedy administration, considered by many to be the architect of the Vietnam War. In the later stages of his life, he did something what I felt was remarkable, and he went on a book tour. He wrote 2 books, In Retrospect and Argument Without End. And in those books, he chronicled the idea that the Vietnam War was based on the wrong information. It was a misunderstanding. We didn't have to do this. This war should have never happened, basically. And that's a remarkable statement, considering that this is coming from the man that was considered the architect of this war. And that lesson blew me away. And I would call that the single most important thing that I took with me during my time from the Kennedy School. And I wish others took the same lesson, because we found ourselves back in that same mess when we invaded Iraq. Another war of choice with disastrous consequences, thinking that we as a country could impose our values, we could remake that country in our image, we could impose our will and our way of life on a nation like this. And it's been a disastrous failure. Even the brother of the president that championed this war refused to defend it when he was asked during a presidential debate. What does that say? What it says to me is that we in this country have embraced wars of choice. We in this country need a different approach. One of the best lines I've heard of President Obama issue recently was, "I want a president who knows that you can't fix everything." And I would want to be a senator that knows that you can't fix everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. The second question goes to you as well. In order to protect itself from growing threats of neighboring countries, would you object to the nuclear armament of Japan as a deterrent against threats from the likes of North Korea and China?
No, I think more nuclear proliferation has never been the answer. At the end of the day, we have to make realistic assessments on what is really necessary there. North Korea is a rogue nation, and that rogue nation has been largely contained. But at the end of the day, issues from North Korea can always arise. But the spread of further nuclear weapons is never a good thing from a world peace perspective. Japan is an ally, and it should stay non-nuclear for the foreseeable future, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. Admiral Sestak, I can repeat the question if you like.
That's okay. Go ahead, please. No, just to make.
In the order to protect itself from growing threats of neighboring countries, would you object to the nuclear armament of Japan as a deterrent against threats from the likes of North Korea and China?
Yes. After I narrowly lost my race, besides teaching at 5 college universities here, later Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, a Republican senator, was the man I most respected down there. We went to Iraq together, asked me to be on the board of Plowshares, which has to do with eventual elimination, or in the meantime, the disarmament of nuclear weapons around the world. Ronald Reagan said he envisioned a world without nuclear weapons. But this issue that he brings up is immense because of what's happening both in North Korea with its nuclear effort, as well as China dominating the South China Sea. The challenge with North Korea is, if North Korea gets one, do you think it's going to trust not having a deterrent against North Korea? How about South Korea? In short, we have seen Japan in the past few months establish its first amphibious brigade. And for the first time, it's moved troops and surveillance radars and others out into the outlying islands because China has moved its Navy through what it claims is inland waterways. There's been 4 naval conflicts out there already. This is the issue of how to use our military wisely. As a Navy admiral, against the opposition of many, I said we should have one of our 2 carriers, not one just in Japan, but one in Guam. We need to have our submarines there not as showing up as though we're going to take on China. We already have troops in South Korea, but we are the honest broker, the ones that are going to say, wait a moment, we will bound you together. We will work with China to try to bring this new international nation of a power into the rules of the road. But North Korea is the issue. And the way to clamp down on that is through primarily China, who really fears an internal implosion where they all go across its border. But that is the key for us with our diplomacy, as I mentioned, is a principle of making China help North Korea eventually disarm. And that will lead to Japan's disarm, not going for nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Admiral Sestak. The third question goes to you. We're back to you. According to recent polls, a slight majority, 53% of Pennsylvanians, favor the U.S. accepting Syrian refugees, which aligns with the majority opinion of Americans. Of those in favor, 33% simply answered yes. The next largest percentage, 18%, said yes, but on the condition that extensive background checks be performed, followed by continuous monitoring. As a U.S. Senator, would you advocate for the United States to accept Syrian refugees, and if so, upon what, if any, conditions?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, our greatest power that we're admired for is the power of our ideals. I also headed the Navy's anti-terrorism unit. I was very involved right after 9/11. I'd come out of the Pentagon. Shortly thereafter, the plane went in. I set up Deep Blue. That was disestablished after a while, a few years back, but they just, with a memo last week, decided to start thinking of reestablishing it. I got to know intelligence and how to do background checks. I support taking in these refugees. Right now, today, they go with 2 years of background checks. They're thinking of shortening it for some, like a family that just arrived yesterday, where it's a woman with a young child. But they also go through a classified program even I don't know before they are brought from overseas to here. Some people divide this nation with freedom, which is based on freedom of religion. I walked to war. I walked on the ground in Afghanistan, a Muslim country in a conflict, but I also was on a ship here at home, operating. And a young Muslim sailor came aboard and said, I need to pray 5 times a day. Would you mind? We didn't have much room, But the head of the air detachment said, I'll give him my office 5 times a day. He's one of us. We have to remember that, yes, we need good security, and we are doing that. But like my father, who was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia, one of the brightest threads we have through the fabric of America is immigration from all over and of all faiths.
Thank you, Admiral. Mayor, I can repeat the question if you'd like.
I'm good. Yes, I'm a father. I'm a father of 3 young children. They're all under the age of 7. And I'm a big, tough guy, but I'm not ashamed to say that there's a picture in the New York Times of a little 3-year-old boy that drowned and washed up on the shore made me weep. And we as this country, I don't understand how people on the other side of the aisle would deny admission to this country to an orphan child from Syria. But yet we've had people running for president on the Republican side that would say we just do that. We cannot turn our backs on these people. Marco Rubio, running for president of the United States, where did his family come from? Cuba. Cuba was a dangerous nation, sworn enemy to the United States, wanted to acquire nuclear weapons, but we welcomed his relatives and those that were fleeing that evil regime. Syrians should be no different, especially since we played a hand in helping destabilize the region as a whole. We have a moral imperative to help take and find and resettle these refugees, because nobody hates ISIS more than the people whose lives were destroyed and their homeland was destroyed by this organization. And as a young father, I would have to think, how bad would it have to be where I live to put my children on my back and walk the mileage equivalent to North Carolina, not knowing what dangers we face, not knowing what lays ahead, and risk their lives to get to a different place and not know where we're exactly going to end up. We are a moral beacon in this world, and we need to hold ourselves to the ideals of the Statue of Liberty and send us your tired, poor huddled masses. Of course there needs to be a background check, but this idea that we have to be afraid of Syrians that are fleeing ISIS, it's just un-American and it's very unpatriotic.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. This question goes to you as well. We are all too familiar with the adage that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. What 2 politicians, living or dead, presidents, senators, congressmen, have most heavily influenced your foreign policy views?
Well, I would say the first one is John F. Kennedy, and this idea during the Bay of Pigs. And if you read accounts during that time, all of his closest advisors were arguing and urging him to strike back against Cuba, which would have probably all but triggered World War III. And he shot back and he said, no, it's not going to be me. I'm not going to go down in history as the president that does this. And you think of the courage that took and the leadership that took, and then you contrast that with the wars of choice that we have entered into, like Iraq, and we're potentially weighing in Syria. And I think that kind of leadership is the kind of leadership that we need in a president or a United States senator. The second one, Abraham Lincoln. I think Abraham Lincoln proved that somebody that never managed anything more than his 2-person law office could go on to help guide and preserve and save the Union and lead military victories, over the South and reunite this country. Simple beginnings begot an amazing career in politics, and he became one of the greatest presidents that ever lived from incredibly humble backgrounds. And this idea that there are so-called experts on foreign policy, again, it's these experts that brought us into these wars of choice. It's these experts that continuously get things wrong. If there's an expert on foreign policy, I want to know he or she is, so I can begin reading them, that would have predicted all of these things or could get us out of these messes. It's a complicated world, and we've made a lot of missteps over the last 15 years.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. Admiral Sestak, I can repeat the question if you'd like.
That's all right. The first one, because he trained me, was President Clinton. As I put together that national security strategy of engagement in this world, whose intention was to secure the peace and prosperity of this nation by rising that up of other nations, I learned a lot. One significant point was we have 3 types of interest: in this country. One is a vital interest, that we will do anything to defend ourselves, because our mere existence is at risk, World War II. Then we have that other great group that John spoke about and Michael Mandelbaum spoke about, important interests, that if they're not properly addressed, will eventually change the character of the world to our harm and others, such as what he raised up of Japan potentially getting a nuclear weapon. Then there, in that strategy as we developed under his guidance, you have to, as even John here would say, and did, you have to weigh the cost and the benefits. And then you need a strategy that actually says there are benchmarks by which you can accomplish it. And if not, why are you doing it? And if you don't have benchmarks that let you know you have to change the strategy to exit or to enhance it, how can you then say, go to war? And then how do you secure the peace? I learned a lot under him. Second is the Republican Chuck Hagel. I went on Meet the Press right after I was elected down there. Freshmen don't usually do, but they called up about Iraq in 2007. He saw me on it talking about this tragic misadventure. And he called up and said, I'd like to go with you to Iraq. Only the two of us. We went in and saw a prime minister of Iraq at that time. Only the two of us with Ambassador neither time. A 15-minute meeting went to about an hour and a half. As I saw this gentleman, this man who had been to Vietnam, tell him that this was theirs to own, and that he needed to bring together Sunnis and Shia together if we were to secure the peace. The competence that gentleman showed, understanding having been to war, is the second one that I would say most taught me, and I respect.
Thank you, Admiral Sestak. The next question goes to you, and in fact, we have various audience questions all coming up on the same topic, climate change. And I have some notes here on climate change, so I'll try to work these all into one reasonable question to get your thoughts on climate change. Now, regarding the Paris Climate Agreement, Secretary of State John Kerry said that the world has come together around an agreement that will empower us to chart a new path for our planet, a smart and responsible path, a sustainable path. In efforts to address climate change immediately, do you believe the U.S. should posture itself as a global leader, or be a team player participating in conjunction with worldwide efforts, or operate as an independent agent working alone to address climate change nationally?
The United States must be the leader on climate change, the number one strategic issue for our planet. In my book, that's what I call it. And I put it in the chapter, the very last chapter, after talking about small business, education, equality for women. I put it at the end of the chapter on national security, because even our Pentagon said last year that the largest threat may be for the future for us, or at least one of the more compelling threats, will be the conflicts and the crises that arise from climate change. The Navy has asked to station its spy planes, its P-8s, back up in Northern Ireland because the Arctic ice is melting, and there'll be a global rush for the resources underneath it. The piers in Norfolk, Virginia are being raised up with $250 million so the carriers might be able to tie up 2 decades from now because the seas are rising. The droughts, the conflicts that can arise is a national security issue. The Paris Accords weren't perfect. They're not enforceable, but yet if we are not leading there, transparently, how can we not? Even your Navy established by 2020 that 50% of all its shore installations will be by renewables, alternative energies, and 50% at sea by alternatives. There's no other entity that has done that. Why? Because it also means jobs. $1 million into oil and gas gives you 1 job. $1 million into solar power energy gives you 4.5. $1 million into wind gives you 5.5, and biomass is even more. This is a win-win. Much as we go towards this effort, gave $10 billion in tax credits to the natural gas industry, and the Navy developed their sonar, which they were allowed to frack because they couldn't do it, at our cost, how could we not be supporting alternative energy of solar power and global and wind, where we developed it, but China and Europe export 99%. This is the number one strategic livable issue for our planet.
Thank you, Admiral. Mayor Fetterman, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes.
Bundling a lot of climate change questions into one and taking some notes I have here. Regarding the Paris Climate Agreement, the Secretary of State John Kerry said that the world has come together around an agreement that will empower us to chart a new path for our planet, a smart and responsible path, a sustainable path. In efforts to address climate change immediately, do you believe the U.S. should posture itself as the global leader, or be a team player participating in conjunction with worldwide efforts, or operate as an independent agent working alone to address climate change nationally?
I would say D, all of the above, because it's that's important of an issue. And depending on who our allies want to be on this fight, we need to take action on it. Nobody argues about the science of your iPhone. You don't have Republicans saying, well, I don't believe that's the way it really works. My gut tells me it doesn't work that way. Republicans, we don't argue about how electricity works. It's agreed science. We don't discuss, I'm not really sure. I don't really see it that way. But why is that the case with climate change? We can't fix what we can't acknowledge. And if we don't acknowledge that climate change is in a massive existential crisis for not only our country, but for the entire world, I fear for my children and my grandchildren. At the end of the day, we have to take definitive steps on climate change. And that's not going to happen in this country without the help of Republicans. Democrats aren't supposed to say that, but I will. Because if you look back at all of the environmental major legacies and initiatives that were successful in my lifetime, they've all were here spearheaded by Republican presidents. Who founded the EPA? Richard Nixon. Clean Air, Clean Water Acts? Richard Nixon, a Republican. Who here, bonus points, knows what the Montreal Protocol was? It got CFCs out of the atmosphere. I remember in school reading how we were going to lose our ozone and get skin cancer before our 30th birthday. But a Republican president and a Congress got it together and banned these substances, and the hole in the ozone is fixed. We in this country have to stop arguing about settled science and stop taking orders from Glenn Beck and others like him to say that this is not a threat or this is an Al Gore publicity stunt or profit. We need to get serious about climate change, and that can only happen with the help of our Republican friends across the aisle.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. This question goes to you. Opinions as to whether enhanced interrogation methods, or more pejoratively put, torture, are split amongst Americans and across party lines. When combating terrorism, should the United States employ such methods, for example, waterboarding, in any attempt to obtain information? If you believe so, explain why such methods are justified. If not, please explain why you would be always against such practices.
No, I wouldn't support torture. It's first and foremost, it's not legal. It's prohibited. So, and I don't believe in this idea of having your attorneys draw up a document saying, well, technically, if you do this and not so much of that, it's legal. We're the United States. We should not torture on moral grounds, but really also on practical grounds. It doesn't produce reliable information. It doesn't make us any safer. It doesn't accomplish anything productive. But what it does do is it creates hatred, and it seeds hatred. And those videos, remember Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq, and how those images and what that did to our country's reputation? Does Guantanamo Bay make us any safer, really, at the end of the day? Or is it a symbol there's no trial, there's no charges, you're just held in infinite detention? It doesn't place us in a positive light across the world. We need to be a beacon. We need to be a leader in these areas. And torture is never acceptable. I can't imagine any circumstances, even in 24 with Kiefer Sutherland or whatever. I mean, this idea that we should be able to torture people, it's fundamentally un-American, and it's also counterproductive to our strategic and security interests.
Thank you, Mayor. Admiral, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, that's fine. No, absolutely not. We don't and shouldn't do it. I mean, we do, but we have in the past. The reason that worked with 20 retired flags and other general officers on human rights about this issue is because we understand in the military our drug advocate generals were always opposed to it, not just because it was wrong. And we don't really get any additional information from it, as tests have shown, or reality has shown, but we don't want our own soldiers to be subject to something where we have broken international law. I can remember being on the ground in Afghanistan beginning of that conflict. And I came to one place and they were bringing up in some prisoners. And at that time, the very, very beginning of the war, there was just some barbed wire thrown up on some 2x4s. There was no stockade or anything. But this one they brought in began banging his head against the 2x4. And I said to the SEAL, I said, what's with him? He said, look, we give him $2,000 on bounties to say if you got a Taliban or you got an Al-Qaeda, turn them into us. He said they give us sometimes, he said it in cruder words than this, the mentally deranged. I always thought, did he end up in Gitmo? Because the issue he asked is broader than that. Of course we shouldn't torture. We can win. We're Americans if we have to go to war. Number two, those ideals we stand for, we shouldn't break them. And third, Gitmo. How could we not have closed it by now? I wonder if he is still there. I just don't know.
Thank you, Admiral. Taking a question from the audience, we're looking at foreign policy without borders, fighting wars without borders. And Admiral, this question goes to you first. And so how do you apply national security when the enemy is ideologically different rather than a defined nation with borders? And an example here, ISIS.
I've been working on this issue since the mid-90s in the Clinton administration. If you go back to the mid-1990s National Security Strategy of Engagement, it actually says in there we should no longer be talking about foreign policy and domestic policy. We should talk about national security policy, because in there it says our borders have truly become ones where dangers can flow back and forth if we're not careful. Disease can be on an airplane that flies over here, or a mosquito. Money laundering, sex trafficking. We're up to 40,000 young women are brought into our country every year. Terrorism. What we have to remember is many of these dangers and challenges begin abroad. And therefore, that's why that strategy that we developed each year was called the National Security Strategy of Engagement. So that if we did have the International Violence Against Women's Act passed in the Senate that I co-sponsored in the House, we could get to those 5 countries that are the major transporters of up to 500,000 a year across the world, and begin to bring peace and stability to there. That maybe they won't, just as one small example, be attracted to the evil because of poverty. I can remember going on the ground in Afghanistan, coming back after years later after carry a battle group and having gone back again on the ground. And I'll never forget looking at it and thinking, if we fixed the illiteracy rate of women in Afghanistan, we would have done more for the global war of terror than anything our military can do in just stopping it. That's where you begin fixing it. And that's why we must recognize with these transnational dangers, our best defense, so to speak, for securing peace and prosperity is being carefully, with all our powers of education, other means, and law, abroad. And that's why this issue on Gitmo and terrorism is something where, how can we lead abroad if we don't follow our own
Mayor,
laws?
would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand it. Is the question, how do we combat ISIS and things?
How do we apply national security is what we're asking. When the enemy we're fighting, I suppose, is ideological rather than drawn sharply by borders. The example here provided by the audience is ISIS.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it comes down to really one core litmus test, and is that threat an existential threat to the United States and our security and our peace and our prosperity? And if it is, you take the appropriate steps to contain it, to seek it out, to root it out, to destroy it, and to secure it. But if it's not, don't let it become a banana peel into a war of choice, a slippery slope into another morass that's going to cost thousands of American lives and potentially trillions of American dollars, not to mention lives of countless people that actually live in the country, whether it's Iraq or Syria or Libya. I don't see it as a complicated issue. It's this idea of, is it in our national interest? Is it a major threat? Or is it something that can be contained? We can keep an eye on it and make sure that it doesn't grow and we're able to take it down without turning our major focuses on or letting it change our way of life.
Thank you, Mayor. This question goes to you as well. And in both candidates, you've both addressed Guantanamo Bay, and so I want to expand on that. And I want to provide 4 options. And so if elected, day 1, U.S. Senator, please consider the 4 following options on the future of Guantanamo Bay and defend your choice. The U.S. should close Guantanamo Bay immediately. The U.S. should gradually phase out the use of Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. should continue its use of Guantanamo Bay as is. The U.S. should increase its use of Guantanamo Bay. Mayor Fetterman.
I think we should immediately shut down Guantanamo Bay. How many years has it been? 14, 15 years? Some of these folks have been in there without any charges, without any idea who they are. As Joe pointed out, the people that were rounded up where it's like, hey, I'll give you a couple $1,000, and they're just like, oh, him. You know, it was just a terrible way to go about doing it. And at the end of the day, Gitmo has remained an enduring symbol of some bad foreign policy decisions. And I think it's important that President Obama reestablished relations with Cuba. I thought it was an appropriate and brave thing to do. And what better way to kind of round out his presidency and his legacy, especially when it comes to Cuba and his diplomacy, would be to permanently close this facility down.
Thank you, Mayor. Admiral, the 4 choices.
Yes.
Close immediately,
I have.
gradually phase out, as is, increase.
Oh, we should close it immediately. And I know the military wants to build a new prison, but we have supermax prisons that we can bring them here. And as I said, when they asked every elected official statewide in 2009 and 10, would you have them come into a supermax here and be tried here? I think, as I remember, I was the only one in Pennsylvania that said, yes, of course. I went out and defended those laws. How could I not think they're strong enough that if guilty, tried here, where several hundred terrorists were tried under President Bush in America, that we aren't strong enough to have our laws throw them in jail if that's where they deserve, under the rule of law. I can remember pulling in to Egypt, and I remember getting underway with some young officers. And they went back the next day as we then went off to the Persian Gulf. I remember a young officer left, says, "Captain, can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." He said, "You treat your enlisted men as though they're equal to you." He said, "They have due regard for rank." He says, "No, that's not what I mean. You treat them as though they're equal human beings. We don't." I thought about that. The kids here from Erie, kids from Braddock. How could we ever condone putting someone outside the rule of law that they are out there defending? I wish we had fought for that every day while I was in Congress. And when President Obama did come out again to say it, I was asked by television station, said, absolutely. And a mosque would be built where it should be built, anywhere in America. This country's freedom of religion and our ideals are under assault. We are fighting for the soul of America right now. And that's a large reason why I'm running.
Thank you, Admiral. We have some questions on Saudi Arabia and the United States' relationship to it. And so I suppose, preface it this way. The United States' relationship to Saudi Arabia: friendship, partnership, in process of divorce. Taking into consideration that the Saudis have left alone Islamic Wahhabi terrorism, what should the future of the United States relationship be with Saudi Arabia, a country which we had previously depended heavily upon for oil and no longer do, as we import only 11% from Saudi Arabia?
Someone that we should work with, but to ours and the surrounding world's common interest. I remember being in Saudi Arabia visiting our air base there. And then when we had the war, they kicked it out just before. And they created that monster, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that's become ISIS. Not maybe in the government, but certainly those that are associated with it, with the funding. And now the monster has turned on it. And as Samuel Johnson said, there's nothing like a hanging to focus your mind. And so now all of a sudden they're bringing together 32 militias, the Sunni militias in Syria, held a conference, and they're trying to have them do the ground game there to go against ISIS, a common foe. And so we should work with them on that. But we also know this, that that country's human rights has to be brought along in a much more stronger way than ever before. Perhaps we didn't do what people say because of oil, but that's not an issue now. Not with our ability to be growing our energy independence. I think that we have to recognize that Saudi Arabia recognizes that right after Israel and us, Saudi Arabia is on its list, as ISIS is, because it wants to establish a caliphate that takes over the world. And so therefore, now is the time with tough diplomacy to make sure that it's brought into a coalition, but a coalition where they are also brought along to make sure that we begin to have the human rights that is to be respected. It's how I feel about nuclear disarmament. I'm for it. But I don't do unilateral disarmament. In the same way with this country, we can use and work with them against common foes, but no longer should we ever be abiding how they pick and choose from individual rights to supporting us when we need support. It's gone on too long with that country.
Thank you, Admiral. Mayor Fetterman, rephrase the question.
Yeah, would you mind?
The United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia, and the way that I had framed it is a friendship, a partnership in process of divorce, taking into consideration that the Saudis have largely left alone Islamic Wahhabi terrorism. What should the future of the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia be, a country upon which we depended on heavily for oil, now reduced to a mere 11% import?
Yeah, I would kind of label Saudi Arabia charitably as a frenemy. I know that's slang, but they certainly aren't our friends, and they certainly aren't our enemies. Although at the end of the day, they are an important, driving, dominant country in the Middle East, and by virtue of that alone, we must engage them. We must have a diplomatic relationship with them. We must hold them accountable to help bring the situation in the Middle East towards stability. Iraq, Syria looks the way it looks today in part because of a proxy war that Saudi Arabia is in with Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia are jockeying for dominance in the Middle East, and as a result, Syria pays for it through its proxy war. We have sold weapons to the Saudis, and look at what they've done in Yemen. They have an appalling human rights abuse. Women, I think, are only now recently allowed to drive or vote. I forget which one, but you can't do the other. I forget exactly which one. And they execute more people in that nation than I believe any other, second only to China. So to say that they share our values, or to say that they are a force for good in the Middle East, simply isn't true. But to eliminate any kind of diplomatic relation with them, or to cast them simply as an enemy based on their human rights record or what have you, again, we do at our own peril, given how important they are in the region. They're always going to have money for the foreseeable future. If we're not buying all of their oil or a lot of it, India, China, and other countries certainly are. So they're a force to be reckoned with, and it's a country that we have to maintain appropriate diplomatic ties, but do so with our eyes wide open, based on a lot of factors, not the least of which is their appalling human rights record.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. The next question goes to you. It's hard to have a forum in Erie, Pennsylvania without questions coming from the audience on manufacturing and its impact on even foreign policy. So I'll phrase this around some notes I have regarding NAFTA. And so according to the U.S. Trade Representative, NAFTA supports more than 140,000 small and medium-sized businesses in the U.S., as businesses now depend upon exporting their products to Canada or Mexico. Conversely, though, the Economic Policy Institute has reported that states with a high concentration of manufacturing jobs have been negatively impacted by NAFTA through job loss, with economist Robert Scott estimating the total loss or displacement of jobs due to NAFTA to total more than 682,000. Do you believe the benefits, particularly if we're looking at manufacturing here with the audience, of NAFTA outweigh negative effects?
I never thought I thought I would leave this world without having to ever utter this phrase, so I'm surprised that I'm going to say it, but Ross Perot was right. You know, that giant sucking sound was American jobs, and a lot of them came from your community. A lot of them definitely came from my community and from my region as a whole. I grew up in York, Pennsylvania. We had the second largest Caterpillar manufacturing plant. No, not anymore. You know what happened to it? It got sent to Mexico to pay their workers literal pennies on the dollar from what they were paying the American workers. So free trade has never been fair trade, certainly for communities like my own, which suffered a 90% population loss, and for towns surrounding it. I wasn't living there at the time, so I can't speak to it as a firsthand witness, but the mills fell like dominoes, in the Mon Valley. And when NAFTA was enacted, that just accelerated what was the initial collapse of the middle class to a full-out war on the middle class. And as a result, I opposed the TPP for this very same principle, that free trade has never been fair trade, and at the end of the day, we know how that movie ends. U.S. Steel today, just in fact, announced several thousand layoffs of their non-salaried workers. U.S. Steel stock price dropped below $10 a share. If that steel mill in my community, the Edgar Thompson plant, goes out of business, as mayor, I'm going to have to say every day, so, what do we want today? Police officers or crossing guards? We still rely on what's left of our manufacturing job and bases, and we have to protect them with the same zeal as we protect technology jobs, jobs in banking, jobs in finance.
Thank you, Mayor Fetterman. Admiral Sestak, would you like me to reframe the question?
No. It's obvious that NAFTA did not work. And most of those youth that he rightly talked about, people who lost their jobs, were most of those here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, were those with a high school education. And any type of effort to have sort of like training for the next level was not there. But what do we do? Because manufacturing's about to come home. In the last 8 to 9 years, China's wages have gone up 15% every year. People are closing factories. I know a gentleman who closed 8 there, brought 6 here, 1 to Thailand, 1 to Bangladesh. Because the shipping has skyrocketed, trying to bring even the goods back here. Because there's only a limited amount, and China's been sucking it all up. And as you know, diesel fuel, while natural gas may be going down in price, has skyrocketed. It's coming home. But if it comes home, as was well pointed out, it's small businesses. 98% of all companies in Pennsylvania and this nation that do manufacturing are small businesses. That's why the Export-Import Bank is so important. It's because 92% of all accounts receivable insurance is by small businesses. And they create 70% of all jobs. This is why you need to look out there with the TPP, which, just like John, I say was wrong, for a number of other reasons also. 8 of the 11 countries have a minimum wage under $3. It didn't protect our intellectual property, which has been called the biggest theft of the world by China. And then a company is allowed to sue us, just like a company did for the XL pipeline, when a government makes a decision. But remember that we're tied in to the world. And as he brought up earlier, Japan out about to get, maybe somebody thinks, a nuclear weapon because it's a little upset over what maybe North Korea, but also China might be doing as it sails vessels there. We need a fair, if you can get it, economic union to try to bound us together, because China is trying to set the rules of the road with an infrastructure bank that even Great Britain has agreed. So let's just do it right. And they're both not the right way, as John pointed out, TPP and NAFTA.
Thank you, Admiral. This question goes to you. Many American companies are eschewing paying U.S. taxes by using safe havens abroad by headquartering their companies off of U.S. soil. Would you advocate for U.S. companies being legally required, to establish their headquarters in the United States as not to avoid paying taxes?
Would I advocate what? Not moving. Yeah, absolutely. We should, inversion, it's called, should absolutely close down. The president, as you know, came out with a new set of rules just before Pfizer for $136 billion was going to let itself be bought by a foreign country. And there was going to have that country loan it money that then it could write off on its taxes here in America as it pays back its own company that it's now been bought for a loan. Take out your iPhone. And then what do? I wrote an op-ed on this about how a few years ago crazy it is. I think it was called the double Irish whiskey with a Dutch sandwich. And because that iPhone, if you sell the technology for it to somebody to use, it's billions, if not $1 trillion, if you give them that technology. You saw Apple trying to protect it. Well, they sell it kind of for themselves to a company overseas for $1 or around that. So it doesn't have to pay the profit of selling it. Then once it's over there, it can manufacture it over there, reap profits everywhere, and then put all the profits down in Bermuda, funneling through Ireland and Dutch. That's why it's called sandwich. And they don't pay taxes. And now they want to bring it home without paying a tax on it? I have to tell you, this is a massive issue. And it is in many, many other areas. Take our telecommunications unions that are happening, called the New Standard Oil. There's only 2 telecommunications industries dominate the top 27 cities here in America, and even Pennsylvania, as well as 26 other legislators throughout this nation, have been pressured by PACs and private money from those telecoms to say, pass a law that says a municipality can no longer establish its own internet, even though Tuscaloosa, Tennessee has done it, and it's many, many, many times faster and at less price that they have there. Yeah, there's corporate power down there that does buy too much from senators and congressmen voting their way. 5 seconds,
Admiral. Thank you. Mayor, would you like me to restate the question?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah, it's appalling. Who here has been following the Panama Papers thing as it unfolds? Like, isn't that a disgrace? Like, and I just think that's just a scratch of the surface of what really is there. If anyone ever had any doubt that the rich are different than you and I, or it's a rigged economy, read about that story and just realize that it's this weird global network of this way of just rigging it at the end of the day because they just don't want to pay their fair share. And that's crazy, and that's outrageous to me. You know, of course we should mandate. I don't understand why it's patriotic to want to join. I understand why it's patriotic to want to join the military and serve your country, but I've never been able to figure out why it's not patriotic to avoid paying taxes to support your country at the same time. And yet we let these countries get away with it rampantly. Apple has over $200 billion in offshore assets that are beyond our reach for taxes, which is outrageous given that our country birthed the iPhone. Our country raised Steve Jobs. Our country provided the infrastructure to give Apple its rise. At the end of the day, we need to hold these corporations accountable. And the way we hold them accountable is to get the money out of politics so we as elected officials can structure the tax code, the trade code, what other ways, and eliminate Panamas and eliminate these offshore tax havens, saying if you want to do business in this country, you have to pay a fixed minimum tax to support the greater good. And that's the legislation that I would support as senator.
Thank you, Mayor. This question goes to you. And similarly, the Washington Post just today reported that the U.S. is emerging as a new haven for tax evaders.
I saw that.
Alongside the likes of Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Panama, so-called tax evaders are turning to states such as Delaware, Nevada, South Dakota, and Wyoming, reports the Post, because they are providing foreigners with the secrecy they crave. What legislation would you propose or support to address U.S. safe havens?
The same way, it's unacceptable. This isn't a states' rights issue to allow, the laundering, if you will, or hiding of business assets. It's just simply inaccessible. The whole system must be transparent. The whole system must be above the books. And at the end of the day, if you're a waitress or you're breaking your back working, construction, you pay your fair share of taxes. Why in the hell have we ever as a society decided that we can allow companies and corporations reaping billions in profits to avoid that same burden, that same obligation? I'll never understand it. So we should not allow it any more within our borders than we should tolerate our companies doing it in Panama or in other countries.
Thank you, Mayor. Admiral, do you want me to repeat the question?
No, that's fine. When I got down there in Congress, the recession had started just a month before. And we tried, through Dodd-Franks and others, to put a referee on the football field up there in Wall Street. The day that crash happened, it was $800 trillion in nominal value of derivatives. A lot of those corporations actually get about $86 billion in these tax credits, if not more. The total share of the corporations to the tax revenues that the United States government gets each year has dropped in the 60s, and I'll be a little off on this, from about 30% or so down to about 9%. And so this is where these challenges happen, because as John pointed out, 433 congressmen and senators, at least since 1998, have taken lobbying jobs after they left Congress. I turned down a $1.2 million job, went to teach. John laughs at me when I say it, but my wife chuckling said, "Hey, Joe, are you sure?" I was a Navy admiral and a congressman. Money has slid so much into our system. It's a shame. Today, somebody from the outside Pennsylvania just decided, I guess, Labor Day, to put in $1 million in the race against us. It's everybody, both parties. It's not just Citizens United. But PAC money influences a lot. And so I really do think if you took money out of politics, you'd fix about 80% of the problems. But there are a few who are willing to stand up and say, no, you're in it for people. And I think that's really what you're seeing with Trump.
5 seconds, Admiral.
That he's yelling at a system they know is wrong, and a false prophet is filling that space because others aren't.
Thank you, Admiral. We just have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to squeeze in and try to put together some here as far as audience questions go. And so, Admiral, the first of the last 2 go to you. Experts have been warning for years about the potential catastrophic disruption of our infrastructure, especially our power grid. How high a priority is our infrastructure in your campaign, and what initiatives will you pursue to head off disaster caused by cyber terrorism?
Yes, I actually, again in the White House, the very first effort of that was under President Clinton, and it was my portfolio until Richard Clark took it over, who was actually a much better individual to have that portfolio. The real challenge here is trying to get government and private industry to come together on it. Apple is a prime example of that. Because in order to work in this cyberspace area, often you bump up against proprietary rights, or even if you want to find out if somebody has gotten into one of the companies and started to take something or starting to probe in it, banks don't want the government or anybody else to know, because they say, well, wait a minute, people will know I'm not that secure, and they may not put their money in for me. I wish we had had that case go to court, because we must resolve the proper balance between civil rights, which needs to be 100% protected, and safeguarding proprietary rights, but also our national security. Because cyberspace is the new domain of warfare. The head of the NSA has called the theft, as I mentioned earlier, from China of our intellectual property the largest transfer of wealth in history. And yet now they're using cyberspace to attack. Imagine, this is what we're worried about in Iraq. There is a dam there about to break. And if it breaks, it is going to flood all the way, potentially, to Baghdad. Damage to those electronic controls and others by cyberspace, by an ISIS group, is the new domain. We struck Iran 4 years ago with a virus that took down its centrifuges for a period of time. That's why I talked about earlier in my comments, we have to be able to stop measuring prowess in numbers, but get to cyberspace to protect ourselves and also to do what we must without kinetic.
5 seconds, Admiral.
We would be high priority.
Thank you. Mayor Fetterman, would you like me to repeat the question?
Reinvesting in our infrastructure would be a top priority of mine. I would concur and support with Senator Sanders' platform of investing $1 trillion in our infrastructure, because without that, we run the risk of becoming a second-rate nation. We've already seen the effects in my community, for example. I have 3 bridges surrounding my community that were all condemned and shut down because they couldn't support the weight of a bus. Do you think I support investment in infrastructure? Yeah, you know. Republicans drive on roads and bridges. Democrats drive on roads and bridges. Democrats don't like to hit potholes. Republicans don't like to hit on potholes. So why can't we agree to invest in our infrastructure, of course, and that includes our electrical grid. For me, cybersecurity is probably the most important aspect of that in terms of investing, because if we don't win there, the results of that could be catastrophic in ways that we can't even conceivably imagine. People followed with great interest the iPhone issue about, well, should iPhone unlock it or shouldn't they? You know what scared the hell out of me is that a bunch of hackers, probably some 13-year-old in his living room, is like, don't worry about it, I got this, you know, and they didn't even need Apple to hack their iPhone. That's scary. That's scary. So from my standpoint, that would be the top priority, because I think the next generation of warfare is going to be fought through cyberspace, and we need to be 10 steps ahead of anybody else in that arena, because if we fail in that area, it could be catastrophic in ways that we cannot currently conceive.
Thank you, Mayor. The last question goes to you first and then to the Admiral. And this is the overwhelming question that was submitted the most this evening, and I too had it on my sheet, so it looks like all of us Jeffersonians are on the same page in wondering your final thoughts on, there are many threats facing the United States abroad. What do you see as the #1 threat to America globally? Mayor Fetterman?
Honestly, it's a slow-moving thing, but I honestly see climate change as the single most pressing issue that we have to address. Of course, there's terrorism, but if we're worried about terrorism as we should be, that's going to exacerbate when the climate goes crazy, when there's droughts, when there's famine, when there's massive ice melts and the seas rise. The Pentagon acknowledges that, and the Pentagon's already planning for a world that includes climate change. Again, what kind of world am I leaving for my children and for their children if we as a nation can't bring the Republicans in and address this very pressing issue? All of these things that we fear, terrorism, geopolitical instability, rogue nations, all of these things are going to become exponentially worse. Scarcity drives this. What drives scarcity, droughts, famines, instability, all exacerbated through climate change. We know it's coming. We're already past the threshold. Ice level melts that were once considered inconceivable are now part of accepted science. When will we get serious in this country and take the appropriate steps to make sure that this issue gets addressed for future generations? We've done it with CFCs. We've done it with lead. We've done it with establishing clean air, clean water standards. Why don't we want to treat CO2 like the pollution that it is and adopt an appropriate solution to head off this massive existential threat to all our security?
Thank you, Mayor. Admiral, would you like me to rephrase the question?
No, that's fine. I would say the #1 long-term challenge we have in day-to-day is trying to come to grips with I called earlier the transnational dangers, of which climate change is one of the highest of those. But it involves those types of threats that erode over time the security and the peace of America, whether it's drugs, whether it's terrorism, whether it's human trafficking, whether it's disease. That erosion over time of our peace, of our security, of our trust in our government, one of the people to be for the people, to be able to handle that in the longer term is the real challenge. We've been kind to come to grips with this, much like it was brought up here in infrastructure and cyberspace, since I was in the Clinton administration, which gets to the second and most important challenge, the dearth of those down in Washington, D.C., particularly the Senate, who have a grasp of this. No one has all the answers. But to have someone on a presidential level say, carpet bomb? I'm sorry, what? We haven't carpet bombed since World War II. What are you talking about? What is the challenges? I bring that up because my fear is, for example, as we try to deal with that, take the question on Saudi Arabia. With Saudi Arabia, the real challenge is that the underwater deal, under the table deal, is with Pakistan. Why Pakistan is now helping against those rebels in Yemen. Because Saudi Arabia doesn't want those rebels to come into its country, and Pakistan, what he's given billions of dollars to, is there help. Why? Because if Iran got a nuke, Saudi Arabia was going to have Pakistan build it, its own. Because, as I said earlier, right after Israel and us, Saudi Arabia is on its table, a list of things. Understanding those intricacies is really this, and the lack of doing that down there is probably our second biggest challenge we have, or we'll get into another tragic affair like Iraq.
Thank you, Admiral. On behalf of the Jefferson Educational Society, Mayor Fetterman, Admiral Sestak, thank you both for sharing your thoughts, concerns, and visions. It indeed appears that we have, in fact, run out of time before we exhausted all the questions. Plenty left to discuss on foreign policies as well as many other issues. But again, I want to move into the closing remark period. And Mr. Sestak, again, having drawn first, you may offer your closing remarks. 2 minutes first. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And John, thank you. I got into the Navy because I met the greatest man ever in my life, my father, an immigrant who was in World War II in the Navy, and I wanted to be like him. And then when Vietnam came along, like I mentioned, I joined up. I never thought I'd stay there that long. I stayed there for the reason I mentioned at the beginning, those I served with. I loved them. I talked about Chuck Hagel and being in Iraq with the Prime Minister, but also went to see some troops there. And of the troops I met, I was sitting down on the mess decks. Like I did as an admiral every night. I'd go down when the planes came back and go down on the mess decks at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, because it's like a hotel, 1/3 of the crew's open all the time, and sit down and calm down with the troops eating and just chat with them, or have them up to my cabin for dinner if so. And I saw this young man, and he was from Pennsylvania, and said, how about a photo? I'll send it to your parents. And when I got home, I did. After I narrowly lost, I stayed in touch with vets. I went invited to a vet parade in Johnstown. I remember the couple coming up to me and handing me an envelope and say, would you open it? And I opened up, and there was the picture. And I said, oh, I remember that day. And my mom said, that's the last picture we had of him. He died the next day. I'd ask everyone here to understand that national security does begin at home. In our youth and how educated and how healthy they are. It's why I got into Congress, to pay back my country, to take care of livelihoods. But I've never forgotten that my job over there, in those 82 countries that the Navy sent me around, and the wars they sent me to, was protect those lives of our most precious asset, our most precious national resource, our youth. I won't ever forget meeting that man or being handed that picture. And I hope we will have down there in Washington soon people who understand better how to use our military in a wise way, not a way that brings tragedy to a family, to a nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral. Mayor Fetterman, your closing remarks.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to give you a false start there.
I was hoping he wasn't hitting me, but no. It's too big. I love John.
I'm a lover, not a fighter. there's an entire roster of communities and towns across Pennsylvania where if you went in and asked the residents, they would all almost unanimously agree that their best days are a generation ago. And those communities, do you think there's any college graduates right now as they're getting ready to finish up their time saying, I have my eye on that nice fixer-upper in Shamokin. I think I'm going to move there after I graduate. Or if there's a graduate at Carnegie Mellon saying, you know, I have my eye on Clairton. I think it's going places. And that to me is why I'm in this race, is because what is the solution for these kind of communities all across Pennsylvania? Because I don't currently believe that these communities have an advocate and a champion. When I went to Harvard to study public policy, a lot of my classmates went on to jobs in kind of what I would call glamour and marquee cities. And I would call those like San Francisco, or stay in Boston, or Portland, Oregon. And those are noble jobs, and that's absolutely their right to do. But me personally, I never wanted to take my career and use that to make San Francisco even more delightful. Because they can do pretty well on their own, and they have. To me, my calling, what I wanted to do with my life professionally, is to try to see what's the solution for all of these Pennsylvania communities, communities like my own. And if there's any lesson from my candidacy or from my time in Braddock, it's that if a community like Braddock that lost 90% of its population, 90% of my town is in a landfill. If my community can get better, any community in Pennsylvania that I've seen and that I'm aware of can get better. And that's what I want to do for you as your next United Senator. Be a champion for all those forgotten communities. Be a champion for people that are living in communities where they believe that their best days are behind them. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Jefferson Educational Society, our Board of Trustees, Erie, Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania Cable Network for broadcasting tonight's event into the homes of Pennsylvanians statewide, thank you, Mayor Fetterman. Thank you, Admiral Sestak, for joining us tonight. For those in the audience and those watching at home, thank you for watching tonight's event at the Jefferson Educational Society. A friendly reminder, the Pennsylvania primary is scheduled for Tuesday, April 26th. We hope tonight's event informed and inspired you, and most importantly, we hope to see you at the polls that Tuesday. From the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan, saying goodnight.
See you soon.